Hello everyone, welcome back. We have another Photoshop tutorial for you this week. This week we're going to cover photo adjustments. More of those adjustment layers that we learned a little bit about last week, as well as a few filters that might be interesting for you. And we'll also learn batch exporting, which can be helpful if you are a photographer and happen to work with raw image files. Now, to do this, we'll need to download a folder from the Files tab on Canvas. So if you go to the Files tab, you should find a .zip folder called Andrew Croft 7. And just like we've done in other weeks, you'll need to download that and unzip it. You can work with any of these photos. I'm just going to pick one sort of at random to work with, but all of the concepts should apply to any of the photos. You could potentially use your own photography, but that's only if you have raw image files. If your camera takes photos and exports as if your camera takes photos and those files are .jpeg or some other non-raw file format, that's not going to work for us that well. Now, this Alexander Croft folder is not a series of photos that I've taken personally, but they are free for you to use. So if you do end up with something that you want to include in your portfolio, you are free to do that. You may have also noticed that we are straying just a little bit from the schedule that's posted under the Files tab on Canvas. Essentially everything's been bumped by a week. We are going to move the fonts tutorial to the end of the Photoshop section, but there was some room in there for us to add at least 2 tutorials over the course of the semester, and this will be one of them. All right, so without further ado, let's get into this thing. I'm just going to select the first image from this series, and if I right-click it, I should be able to open with Photoshop. And if you don't have that option, you can always choose another app and then choose Photoshop. If you see thumbnails in Windows, chances are Photoshop is reading that stuff for you since these are raw image files. So as we open it, something interesting is going to happen. It'll be a little bit different than what we're used to opening JPEGs directly in Photoshop. It will automatically open a filter. So kind of similar to what we did with the dust and scratches filter, only it's a much more complex filter. So as soon as we open it up, if we've never used Camera Raw before, it's going to give you a couple of options with user interface. So it kind of depends on your personal workflow, how you want your tools to be laid out. So in this case, you have thumbnails at the bottom. In this case, you have thumbnails on the left side, and tools are both on the right side regardless. Whichever one you choose is just fine. You just might find some of your buttons are in a different place than mine. So you'll get this other window here if you've never opened the Camera Raw filter before, and that says, hey, these are the things that are somewhat different from the earlier versions of the Camera Raw filter. So if you are somewhat familiar with this, but it's been a while, then maybe this is something to read. If you've never used it before, no worries. We're going to kind of go over at least the simpler aspects of the Camera Raw filter. If we click Get Started, we will just jump into the filter. So the idea is if you have a raw image, it has a lot of versatility in terms of what you can do to manipulate that image. So there's a lot of room for you to increase the highlights or bring down the shadows or adjust the color to make your image look like what you want it to look like. And the Camera Raw filter allows you to manipulate those elements. So if we look on the right side, we see a whole host of adjustments that we can make. Even in the basic tab, we have a significant amount. We also have tools on the right side of the adjustments area where we can crop our image. We can use something very similar to the spot healing brush. We can use an adjustments brush. So again, something very similar to creating masks there. And then you have snapshots and presets. So if you create a preset, something that looks good for one photo and you'd like to add it to another, you can access that under presets. You save your preset and then you apply the preset. Snapshots are very similar where we can look at our custom settings on the fly, but presets also has a whole host of presets that are already kind of ingrained in the program. So if we go under the color tab here, we have a bunch of options, and this is maybe a good place to go if you just have no idea what you want to do with the image, and rather than experiment with all of the tools available to us, we can kind of see what works for a variety of images. So if I look at natural, looks pretty good, bright looks pretty good, and maybe we can find something in here that's a good starting point, then we can go back to edit and adjust things from there. You can see once we go back to edit, we see that the highlights, the shadows, the whites, and the blacks have all been adjusted already. And these are just preset numbers. So regardless of the image that you're bringing in, it's going to move those numbers in the same exact way. So if you like something here and then you bring in that image that has a dark background, maybe this doesn't work the same way as with the lighter background. So you do need to know what these things do so you can adjust accordingly. Now, what do they do? Let's take it step by step really quickly. So temperature adjusts how warm or how cool your image is. The more you go in the left direction, the cooler it gets. You see how blue she becomes, and if we end up on the very far end of that spectrum, it's really icy. It looks very unnatural. But a little bit of a cool temperature can look fairly natural and change the mood or the theme of your photo. You can likewise go in the other direction and make everything warm. You can see that even like the whites of her eyes are a little bit warm here. So the further you take it, again, she becomes very orange and unnatural, but a little bit in either direction isn't a bad thing. And maybe you can just find something that fits your personal aesthetic. It's totally up to you how you want to approach it. Now, tint a little bit goes a long way with tint. You can either move towards the greens or the magenta colors, which are a lot less natural than warm and cool. So warm and cool we see all the time with just light temperatures. So if you're a film production student, you know about tungsten light and daylight bulbs, right? Two different color temperatures, one being much more blue, the other one being much more orange. And we see that in incandescent bulbs and other types of bulbs in the house, as well as out in nature. Daylight is daylight color, right? So those things you see a lot more commonly in analog photography, and therefore it looks a little bit more natural. Now you could push your stuff into the greens or the magentas. Um, if you can make that work creatively for you, great. If not, maybe your stuff starts to look like alien-esque, which maybe isn't the best thing for some modeling photography like what we have in front of us. Exposure. Exposure is just the brightness or darkness of your image. This is like a global control, so it adjusts everything in the image. So as we start to turn this stuff down, you can see that like contrast is changing if you know anything about like a histogram, but it's not intended to be the thing to adjust contrast. So if you want your image to be darker or brighter, you just adjust exposure. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you do too much exposure control unless your image looks pretty bad initially. If it's overexposed, if it looks like this, then you probably do want to add a little bit of exposure control. And what's really helpful about these raw images is you have that option to adjust exposure without destroying the image. If you had a JPEG in here and it was overexposed, chances are you wouldn't be able to retain any information there. Now, contrast increases the contrast of the image. So your brights will get brighter. If you look at your histogram up here, you can kind of see what's happening. So this is the bright end of your image. So all of the very high highlights in her hair, and then this big spike here is probably all of this background that's like a pure white. Also this little area down here that is maybe like a white dress. It would be in the high end of the histogram. Everything that's dark would be in the low end of the histogram. You can kind of hover over these things and it tells you exactly what these areas correspond to. So these are your blacks, these are your whites, highlights, shadows, midtones. So as you adjust blacks, whites, shadows, highlights, and midtones, you can see your histogram change. As we turn up the contrast, we can see that your highlights are moving to the far end of the histogram and your shadows are moving to the other end of the histogram, which essentially increases the space of the midtones. So as you turn up contrast, you get more detail, you see more detail in the midtones and less detail in the highlights and shadows. And generally that makes a slightly more pleasing image because what we care about is usually in the midtones. Now, if it's not in the midtones, all of a sudden contrast becomes an issue for you. If what you want people to look at is actually in the highlights or the shadows, you probably don't want to use a universal contrast control. So this is probably just too much for my taste, so I'm just going to turn it down a little bit. There was plenty of contrast in the image before. It is turned up a little bit. It's a plus 15. A little bit goes a long way, and generally when I see people getting into photo adjustments, they tend to put too much contrast in their image because it kind of looks nice to them and they want it to look even nicer, so they go a little bit too bold there. Now we can add contrast by turning up the highlights and turning up the whites and turning down the blacks and the shadows. It would do the same thing essentially, right? You would push the highlights and whites up further and the shadows and blacks down further, therefore expanding the area of midtones. But you can also work kind of closely in these areas. So if you find that you've turned up the contrast, but you'd like to bring up the blacks because they look a little too black, you can certainly do that. You can likewise turn up the shadows if an area of shadow seems too bright, or you can bring it down if you need it to come down a little. We can do the same things with the highlights and the whites. And now we've started to make some fairly significant changes to our image. So if we want to see what it looked like initially versus what it is now, there are a couple of buttons towards the bottom of the window that you can toggle on and off, and there's a bunch of options with them too. So the button on the right side allows you to toggle before and after. I greatly prefer just to use this button to toggle things off and on to see what we've actually done. So it is a subtle adjustment. This is before with nothing on it. And these are the adjustments that we've made working purely with the tonal range, right? The darks and the lights and where we want those things to be. But if we move down just a little bit, we can see texture, clarity, and dehaze. If you turn these things up or down, that'll give you a much better idea of what they actually do than me trying to explain it. Texture will increase our ability to see the texture if you turn things up, and if you turn it down, you'll see that your image gets a little bit more blurry looking. You don't see as much texture. So if you really want to be able to see her hair, you can turn up the texture. You can even paint in just her hair to have that texture control using the adjustment brush here. So if we turn that up really quickly, and if I like what the texture looks like, but I only like it for the hair, I can move over to the adjustment brush, and then I can paint in just that adjustment in a specific area. So if that adjustment is texture and I want that texture to be 100 so you can see it, I see that I now have a brush with a nice feathered edge that I can paint in the hair. And if I need to adjust like the brush size, I can do that here. And I'm not doing the greatest job at this, so I cut a little bit of her face and stuff. That's not what I would prefer. And likewise, I don't really like what the hair looks like. Maybe that texture looks a little bit harsh still, so we can always adjust that after we've painted in our mask area. We can just go back to the texture control and turn that down, and it's only affecting where we've painted. So if we wanted to turn up the texture up just a little bit there without messing with the rest of her face, we could do that. If I head back on over to the Edit tab, I can continue working on the overall image. Now under texture, you see clarity. That does something similar but different. It looks a little bit like sharpening on the image and a sort of hazy look instead of just like a blur. Again, it's something that's a lot easier just to look at and see what it does versus actually explain. Dehaze again does something similar. As you turn up the dehaze, it gets a little bit sharper, and as you turn it down, it gets hazier. So it gets both brighter and blurrier. Maybe a little bit of haze looks nice with an image like this, but the more you go into the negative with dehaze, the more things start to look like yearbook photos a little bit. So maybe we stay away from that, or maybe it fits with your aesthetic and you want to use it. Vibrance and saturation both work with color. So you see that there's a little bit of an increased like saturation look to our image. We haven't adjusted saturation, but instead we adjusted vibrance, which does something incredibly similar to saturation. So there's our vibrance control. If we turn up the contrast, or if we turn up the saturation, we see the colors pop or turn black and white on the far end of the spectrum. If we do the same with vibrance, we don't see the colors completely disappear, so maybe it's more of a subtle correction than saturation. But you can adjust these things on your own and find what works for your image again. You can tell the difference between each of these things because these sliders sort of indicate what's going on. So temperature, you see the blue end of the spectrum. So if you move that direction, your image gets bluer. If you move the other direction, your image gets yellower. It's more orangey, but it's a good indication of what you're doing. Tint, more green left, more magenta right. Exposure, texture, clarity, dehaze, all that stuff, you'll see black and white. So it doesn't mess with the colors at all. Instead, it messes with the brightness or darkness. In the case of texture, clarity, dehaze, you have a barrier between that and the luminance adjustments, texture, clarity, dehaze. These three deal with how in focus or clear or hazy your image is. It doesn't really mess with how bright or dark things are. Vibrance and saturation, you can see it go from a gray scale to almost like a rainbow color. And that doesn't mean that things are getting more yellow and then red as you move in that direction on the spectrum. Instead, it just means that the color is getting more intense in one way or another. Now, what I would recommend if you're a beginner is just to work with the tools that I mentioned previously, but if you are familiar with curves from another class, you can certainly do that here, and we'll cover curves in our adjustment layers. So you can apply those aspects directly to this area if you want to come back to it. If you find that that tool works for you, then work with that tool. A lot of people are either slider and color wheels people or curves people. There are some people that use both interchangeably. Usually you'll find people with a preference on these things. So if you feel like curves is a little bit more natural for you, feel free to use curves. Beyond this, there are several other options that you can use to tweak your image, and a lot of these things are kind of specialty. So if you wanted a vignette around your image, you wanted those darkened edges, those that is available to you inside the effects dropdown. You can also find things like adding digital noise or grain to your image if that's something that you want in terms of like an aesthetic choice. All of that stuff is here. These are very much more like niche tools, but you might find yourself using them very often depending on what your aesthetic is. So I highly recommend that you just open these things up and experiment with what they do and stuff. If you're at all concerned about losing something in your image that you otherwise wouldn't want to, make sure that you create a snapshot or a preset so then you can always get back to what you did before. So before I open this thing up, I do think that this is just a little bit distracting, the bit of dress there, and I can't really tell. I don't have context that it's a dress or if it's intentional or what. So I'm going to go ahead and crop that really quickly using the tools inside the camera raw filter. If I go to crop and rotate, I can go ahead and crop things a little bit. So I can click, drag, and hold and bring my edges in closer. Now when I'm happy with everything, I'm happy with my crop, I'm happy with my image adjustments, I'm happy with everything inside the camera raw filter, maybe I want to go into Photoshop and do some additional Photoshop stuff, or maybe I'm just happy with this and I'm finished at this point. So you have two options. You can either click open, where you'll now open your image inside Photoshop to do additional corrections or maybe add text or something that is purely Photoshop and not just in this camera raw filter, or you can press done and it will just kind of go away. So what happens when you press done? It doesn't it doesn't create like a JPEG or an export for you or anything. It actually saves all of the stuff that you did in that camera raw filter as metadata. So if I go back to my Explorer window in the Alexander Croft folder, I'm going to see that there's image 7169 and then image 7169.xmp. So that is like a metadata file. So as soon as I reopen this image, if I open with Photoshop, it reopens it in the camera raw filter and all of those settings that I've made are saved. So that XMP is a very, very small file, but it saves all of those adjustments for you and then applies those to the photo as you open it. Now, if I click open, that metadata file still exists, but the image also opens inside Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and click open and do some additional work here. So now that it's in Photoshop, I could potentially export this thing. You see how it's a .cr2, a camera raw image file? If I wanted to post this on Canvas, I would have some trouble with that because web browsers can't understand .cr2s very well. So if we needed this to be a web format, we could then export this as a JPEG, just as we've done with every other image that we have, and then we would be good to go. This leads us to some issues with CR2s. So if you are a photographer and you happen to shoot 300 photos and you don't have your camera set where every image is also saved as a JPEG ready for the internet, and you don't want to sit down and edit 300 photos, you just want to put those things out there easily and quickly, you run into a bit of an issue. You would have to pop each individual into Photoshop and then export them unless you used a batch process. So I'm going to show you that really quickly. So you don't even have to have your image opened up or any image opened up. All you have to do is be inside the program. You go to File, then Scripts, then Image Processor. You'll have a few options here and you'll need to tell the computer how you want to proceed to make your batch work. So the first thing we want to do is we want to tell the computer where all of our images are. So if we click that button that says select folder there, we can then navigate to our folder. The Alexander Croft folder is what we want there. We're going to go ahead and click select folder. Then you have the option to open first image to apply settings. So in the case of like camera raw, you can click that on, it will open up the camera raw filter. You can make adjustments, and now those adjustments will be applied to each image as it's opened and then exported afterwards. So if you have something that you want to add, maybe you want to make all of your images just a little bit cooler, you can make that adjustment, and then as it runs the batch, it's going to make that same adjustment on every single image. Step 2 here is where is the stuff going to be saved. If you want it to be saved in the same exact location, you can do that. If you want it to go to a separate folder, that's probably a better idea. So we can just like create a new folder in the Alexander Croft folder that says exports. We select it and then click select folder, and you can see that now all of our exports are going to go in the same place. Finally, this is the most important thing. How do you want it to be saved? You could save it as a Photoshop document, but again, that would give us some trouble going out to the internet. You could save it as a .tiff, or you can save it as a JPEG. And remember that our JPEG quality can go all the way up to 12, so you can adjust that as necessary. You can make your quality a little bit smaller if you need a smaller file size. So resize to fit would resize our image to fit a particular size. So if you knew exactly how big every image needed to be, say for like thumbnails or something like that, you could select that on and then adjust the width and the height. So if you needed everything to be 1920 by 1080, you could select that on and then put in 1920 by 1080 and it would automatically conform all of your photos to be that. There is one more option in here called preferences. So you see a run action. You could potentially do some kind of like special effect on all of your images. You could add a wood frame to all of your images. A lot of these things look a little bit basic. I don't generally use that stuff, but you could if you want to, and you can look at it and see what it does. And if it does something that's pleasant for you, you can certainly add it. You can also add copyright info, so that's embedded as metadata in your image. So if it's your own particular image and you want to potentially sue someone for stealing it, adding a copyright info metadata tag in there could help you if those people don't rip the metadata out of the photo before posting it somewhere where they're not allowed to, or making money off of it or something. So when you're happy with everything, you can either save this as like a preset so that you can use it over and over again, or you can just click run and it should start working for you. So it'll open the very first image, and we told it to open it for image adjustments, and maybe we could make some image adjustments. It looks pretty good as is, but let's just do a couple of changes. We'll make our image just a little bit cooler, and we'll say, hey, that looks pretty good to us, and we're happy with it. We click open, and then it's going to do the batch export. So there it made the change, and then it did a save, and now it's opening a new one, making that same change, and then saving as a JPEG. So you don't have to do all of the stuff yourself. So instead, the computer is running all of the actions that you would need to do to make a slight adjustment and then export as a JPEG for you. So all you have to do is sit back and let it do its job. If you have 300 of these, you can see how this would be incredibly valuable to you. If it's just a small series and you do want to make the adjustments, it's probably not something that you'll want to do necessarily. But if you do have a camera that shoots .cr2s, and maybe you make the mistake of shooting a full day of .cr2 and you don't want that, you can do this very simple process to make your life a lot easier. Now, if we head back into our Explorer window, we can see that, hey, we have this new folder called exports, and if we pop in there, we can see that we have a series of JPEGs now that are ready to go out onto the internet. So back in Photoshop, I have another filter that I want to show you, an additional filter that is both interesting and controversial. We can add it just by heading up to the Filter tab at the top of the screen and then going to Liquify. So the liquify filter allows you to do a lot of things with any image, but as soon as you bring in a photograph of a human face, the AI will recognize that it's a face and give you a bunch of tools specifically for the human face. So there are these tools in here that can come in handy if you're doing something maybe surreal. There's the pucker tool and the bloat tool and the twirl tools, which would do essentially like these things. It would twirl the image, right? Or it would make an area of your image larger. So if I just turn up the brush size here and I wanted to bloat out the eyes like this, it would be a very silly thing to do. Or I could also pucker in the eyes. Again, you can adjust your brush size with the brackets there. Things that would be very unnatural to do, especially with a human face. These tools are available to you if you're working in illustrations. Maybe they make more sense to use there. But what I really want to talk to you about is the face tool in here. That you can do significant adjustments with the human face. And subtlety goes a long way with this, and morally or ethically, it may not make sense for you to do too much, but it is incredibly powerful. And I just want you to be aware that it exists. If I look over to the right side of the screen, I can see brush tool options, and we don't have to worry about that stuff. But if I just like kind of hover around my image, we can see that there are outlines for different areas. So it can see where the eyes are, it can tell where the nose is, the bottom of the nose, and where the lips are, and where the face is. All of these things are then adjustable to us. And we could just do it inside the canvas here, or we can go into sliders for any of these things on the right side of the screen. Now, if I twirl down on eyes really quickly, we can see that there are eye size, height, width, tilt, and distance from each other, and I can adjust any of these things independently or gang together. So if we do an eye tilt, we can see that the left eye and the right eye work independently, so I can tilt the left eye in one direction or the other direction. So if you have a person that has a slight tilt to one of their eyes, we can actually correct for that. And then if we want to tilt both, all we have to do is click the little gang button here, so it looks like um, so that's a button that looks like chain link next to each other. The gang button appears in all kinds of programs, so make sure that you know what that thing does. But we can then tilt both of our eyes in coordination if we'd like. And then we could also potentially add width to our eyes. Height to our eyes. Turn up the eye size if we'd like as well. And at this point, she looks like an alien, but you understand how significant this tool can actually be. So it's not really affecting anything other than the eyes here. It masks everything for you and adjusts these things on the fly. So if you consider where we were last week, where we had to create masks ourselves painstakingly just for color, we can actually have these masks created instantly and smoothly without any kind of ugly outlines. And we can adjust significant things like the size and distance of these items. We can also adjust where the nose goes. We can adjust the shape of the lips or the size of the lips. Now, if at any point you've gone a little bit too far, you want to reset what you've done, there's a little button up here for reset, and you can just kind of reset everything back to scratch and then potentially work very subtly in these areas, which I think is a very important factor here. Work as subtly as possible. So if I try to work ethically here, I might say that this eye looks a little bit more closed than this eye. Maybe it wasn't the perfect time to snap a photo, but we like the pose and we like everything else about it. So let's just kind of correct that right eye a little bit. So I can go to eye height and it would be the right eye, and we don't want them getting together. We just want the right eye to turn up just a little bit. Now that eye looks a little bit bigger or a little bit more open depending on how you look at things. If I want to see before and after, I can toggle off and on the preview checkbox down here. And that doesn't really change her face shape too much. Maybe I went a little bit too far in the eye height there. Maybe that's a little bit better. 17 up. Yeah, that's nice and subtle, but it corrects a little bit for an issue that was just in camera. Now you could go a lot further with it as well if you wanted to potentially add a smile to our character. We could potentially add a smile to our subject. We can do a ton of stuff in this tool. So it's another one that I would recommend that you come to and experiment with. And again, a little goes a long way with this stuff. So I'm just going to make my eye correction here. I'm not going to mess with any other parts of her face. You are totally free to mess with her face as much as you want in your version of this. Okay, I have one more section for you, and it might take just a minute to get through. And honestly, you might not need this nearly as much as you might have before, but we're going to go over it anyway. And that's all of these adjustment layers. So we learned about hue and saturation last week. Let's find out what all of these other things do. And they all work exactly the same. So as you create this adjustment layer, you'll always see that there's a thumbnail on the right side, and you can create masks using selection tools or paint brushes. All of that stuff's available to you. So you can do these things just as an area of the image and not the overall image. You can also add blending modes and opacity to any of these things to kind of blend them in a little bit better. But in case you don't know what these things do, I'm going to do a quick crash course on all of them. A lot of them are available inside the camera raw filter, so that's why you might not use them nearly as much as what you would have in the past. So first up is brightness and contrast. If I click on it, I can see that the brightness and contrast adjustment layer pops up in my layers panel there, and it is on the uppermost layer. Now, brightness, adjust the brightness of our image, go figure, and contrast, adjust the contrast of our image. These are things that we did cover in the camera raw filter tutorial. So same thing here. Brightness isn't in there because it is a very, very basic tool. It's kind of similar to exposure, I guess, and then contrast. Contrast increases our level of interest in the midtones. It makes the highlights brighter and then the shadows darker. If we click on auto, it will auto adjust these things. It will take the brightest pixel and take it to its absolute brightest, and it'll take the darkest pixel and make that a pure black. So we can see that our blacks are very, very black, and maybe that's not what we want to do. So auto image adjustments, not the best thing in the world to do because it really depends on your content. So I'm just going to leave this one on here, even though it doesn't look that great, because I want to show you how things work in coordination. So I'm going to go ahead and add a hue and saturation now. And we know what this tool does. It does work a little bit differently if your image is already in color. We don't have to toggle on the colorize thing, but we can adjust the saturation of our image. We can adjust the hue as well, and we can adjust the lightness too. So here's the deal though. These things, these adjustment layers, affect everything underneath it. So if I make this adjustment, the hue and saturation adjustment, and then I move my brightness and contrast above it, you can see that my image changes because the hue and saturation is affecting the brightness and contrast. So you can see that the image changes as I flip-flop these two filters. It is a subtle change, but I think that you can see it. So as I flip-flop them, you can see that the image changes just a little bit. And that's because it matters which one comes first. The hue and saturation is now affecting the brightness and contrast, which is affecting the background, but the brightness and contrast is only affecting the background layer right now. It's not messing with the hue and saturation. So the differences between these layers will become much more apparent as you start working with masks and multiple layers. Now, if you want any of these adjustment layers to only affect the layer directly beneath it, there is an option for that. So on any of these adjustment layers, at the bottom of the properties window, you'll see this little icon that looks like a rectangle with a right angle arrow and a strike through it. And if you click that button, you'll see in your layers panel that things change a little bit. You can see that little right angle arrow appear next to your layer, which indicates that it's only affecting the thing right beneath it. Anything beyond that, it's not. And you may be able to get around using this for the time being if you have a single image and lots of masks to kind of eliminate the crossover between these adjustment layers. But as we get into composited images like we're going to do next week, you'll see that if you have several layers from different images or several layers of an image that's supposed to look like one single image, you'll probably want to use adjustment layers that only affect single areas of that image so you can get everything looking uniform. If that's at all confusing for you, don't worry because next week we'll go into very fine detail on that. So let's continue down the adjustment layers. I'm just going to toggle off the ones that I've put on here so far. I'm going to click on the one right next to brightness and contrast, that is levels. It's another way to adjust the contrast of your image. You'll see quite a few ways to do that. And in here we see something very similar to the histogram we saw in the camera raw filter. You can see that this area is the darkest areas of our image. This area is the lightest areas of our image. We can see that big spike for that white backdrop around our subject. Now, if we want the darkest part of our image to become black, all we have to do is click one of these arrows and bring that inward. Now you can see that the darker areas of her hair here are now pure black. If that's what we wanted, we can do that. We can also make the lighter parts of our image brighter. So at this point, we have some stuff in her skin or hair that have now become a pure white because this is that pure white that we had before. And then we can see that there's some textured areas here because it's not a pure white, it kind of moves around. So as we click and drag this arrow, we can see that our highlights, or the areas closest to white, are now getting brighter. And then this middle area adjusts our midtones. So if we want our midtones to be darker, we can move in one direction. If we want our midtones to be lighter, we can move in the other direction. So it's a simple kind of, I guess, mathematical way of approaching contrast. You can see that histogram and then just move your shadows, midtones, and highlights where you want them to be. I'll just shy out that layer too, and we'll head on over to the next one, and that is curves. A little bit like levels, but it's also kind of like a line graph. So this line that goes from the bottom left corner to the upper right corner, this is a pure black, this is a pure white. In case you have trouble with that, you can see it right here, black, bottom, left, white, top and right. Now we can adjust where things go on the line, right? So this is our shadow area, the bottom left, but not at the very, very bottom left. The very, very bottom left is pure black, but things close to that would be shadows. And we can click and create some nodes. So let's put one in the shadow area and then maybe the highlight area, and then we have midtones in between. So if we click and drag our shadow down, we can see that our shadows are getting darker. If we lift that up, we can see our shadows get brighter. And if we bring those shadows downward and we bring our highlights upward, we can see that we've effectively we've effectively added a bunch of contrast to our image. So just like what we talked about before, shadows getting darker, highlights getting brighter, and then our midtones expanding. So there's more space in these midtones here. Now curves isn't just limited to tonal adjustments, but also color adjustments. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete my curves and add a new one so I don't have that tonal adjustment. So I can go into the red, green, and blue channels. And if I bring up the reds, you can see my image get redder, and I'm bringing up the reds everywhere, but mostly in the midtones. And then I could potentially do something like bring the greens down. Now my image is getting even redder, but it's kind of magenta. It's a mix of red and blue. So you have red, blue, and green. You can adjust those things independently using curves as well as some other tools. I'm just going to shy out my curves, and I'm going to move over to the next adjustment layer, and that is exposure. So let's go ahead and click that really quickly. So exposure is the same thing that we learned in the camera raw filter. If you want your image to be brighter or darker, there are some additional sliders there if you want to be more precise about things. Vibrance was also in the camera raw filter, so it's very similar to saturation. So as you turn this stuff up, color intensity will also turn up. There is a saturation control in here as well. So if you prefer to use vibrance and saturation rather than the hue and saturation, you are free to do so. We're familiar with hue and saturation, so I can just skip that one. Instead, I'll head on over to color balance. And now we're somewhere that looks kind of similar to what we had with curves and adjusting the red, green, and blue channels. Instead, what you have is you can adjust the cyan, magenta, and yellow channels in the shadows, midtones, or highlights area. Now this actually can come in handy for some creative adjustments. So what I like to do with a lot of my videos is add a little bit of blue to my blacks or blue to my shadow area. And it helps things kind of pop, especially if it's a warmer looking image or has skin tones to it and stuff. So just to show you how that works, I'm going to head on over to the tonal region of shadows, and then we're going to push things a little bit bluer. And we can see that we're getting a little bit of like a magenta color in there too, so we can add a little bit of green to it without really hurting anything. So there, my shadows have turned kind of blue, and with it off and on, you can see what that does. Adds just a little bit of a pop to our image. And that looks pretty good, actually. I would keep that probably if I was editing this photo. It wouldn't work with everything, but feel free to experiment here. Adding a little bit of color to your shadow region can really help make your image pop without having such a strong influence as, say, like the midtones. So if I go back into the midtones, we can push things red, and all of a sudden things get really red. It starts to affect things that we actually look closely at with our image. So if that's someone's face, that's probably trouble. Okay, I'm going to try that one out, and then I'm going to head over to black and white. If I click that on, you can see our image goes black and white. That is what black and white does. If you need quick black and white, you can click that. You can just as easily use like a hue and saturation or a vibrance and saturation, bring those numbers all the way down to 0, and your image should turn black and white. You can certainly use masks on this to make most of your image black and white, and then keep some color there as well if you wanted to do something very bold like that. One further down the list is the photo filter. So if we click that on, we can see a series of photo filters. There's a drop down here, there's a warming filter, there's a cooling filter, there's all sorts of colors as well. So if I turn on a cooling filter, you have a density of that filter as well. So as you turn that thing up, the cooler your image actually gets. Now, this may make sense to you if you are like a photographer and you're used to working with filters that you put on the front end of your lens. Otherwise, chances are you'll probably gravitate towards other areas because it's a little bit more defined and you have more options with the tools. Now, if you find that this is an easy way to work and you want to work with the photo filters, feel free. It can be very quick to work with, but I usually find that there's just not enough options for me to use it regularly. One further down the list here is the channel mixer. So you can go into any of the red, green, or blue channels. So all of your digital images have red, green, and blue, and those are the only colors in there, and how they mix gives you the actual color that you see. So you can go into the reds and potentially make the reds more red. Or if your image happened to have some kind of like white balance issue, you could adjust that. If your reds look funny for some reason, you can certainly adjust that too. The presets are always going to be red. When you go into the red channel, you'll see red at 100%, green and blue at 0. Green's at 100 and the other two are at 0, and blue would be at 100 and the other two would be at 0. So as you adjust these things, if you end up moving numbers where they shouldn't be and stuff, you can just move those things back. You can also tint certain colors as well. So maybe the reds and the skin tones aren't looking how you want them to look. They're just like too red. You can start to pull that down, and then all of a sudden greens and blues are mixing in there. This is generally not something I mess with too often, but if you did happen to have like a white balance issue, or your camera gave you back something that was really unnatural, it could potentially come in handy, just not super common to use. One further down the list is the color lookup table. So if you are a video person and you use LUTs, so those are lookup tables for potentially cameras or just generalized looks, right? So for beginners, this probably isn't going to make a huge difference for you, but I know that we have at least a few video people in the class, and if you are familiar with lookup tables, LUTs, and you want to use those outside of video in the photo world, you can certainly use those here. So you add the adjustment layer, the color lookup, and then you use the drop down here to navigate to your lookup table or your .3dl or .look or .cube, and then you can select it, and then it's a certain look that is added to your image. So a lot of people in the video world buy LUTs or make LUTs, and then you can use those not just on your video, but also in your photography. All right, we're moving down into the last row here, and these things are highly unlikely that you use very often. They're like specialty filters, special effects, right? So if I click on that first one, invert is going to invert our brights and our darks, so the dark stuff gets bright and the bright stuff gets dark. One to the right is posterize. If we click on posterize, we can see that it does this, what I would consider a kind of ugly effect, but it takes all these regions of color and luminance and groups them together. So all the highlights now turn into just like a pure color here, this yellow color. So it could work well for maybe some kind of vintage look that you're trying to do, or maybe you have some creative purpose to use the posterize filter, but generally it's something that looks not great aesthetically to me personally. I'll try that one out, and we'll head on over to threshold. So it does something similar to posterize. I would consider this closer to like a Xerox scan effect, right? So you can adjust the levels that are here as well. So you just find something that gives you the effect that you want. And it's just like an extreme version of contrast. So the darks are a pure black and the whites are a pure white, and that's it. There's no gray in there. It's just black and white. This could actually come in handy if you're trying to do some sort of illustration out of a photo. or you're going to do like a flyer or something and you need a very stark image. It can also work pretty well as like a thumbnail image. If we use the crop tool and we crop this down, we can have something aesthetically very, very different in just a few seconds. The selective color adjustment layer is pretty similar to the channel mixer. We can go into any of the color channels. This time you have cyans, magentas, and yellows, as well as blacks to work with, so it is a little bit more defined. And also things don't move quite as prominently with the sliders, so as you turn this stuff up, it doesn't become so bold as the channel mixer. If you have relative selected, it's going to be even less prominent. If you turn on absolute, it becomes more prominent, but even then, it's not super bold. We have just one left, and that is the gradient map. If we turn that on, we can see that we can create a gradient, and right now the gradient is just pure black, but we can change these colors here. If we look at the bottom two squares with arrows here, if we double click that, we will have the option to change the colors. So if we want to map from red to yellow, we can change those two colors, and then we have this. We're basically sucking all of the color out of the original image, and where our original image goes from black to white and all of the shades in between, we're replacing those colors with these specific colors. So the blacks appear as this like darker red, and the lights appear as this more yellow color. Again, I guess it's very similar to like that threshold where it could work in a really creative sense. A flyer it would be great with. So all of that bottom row works as like a very bold creative decision. And you can always make these things a little bit more subtle by using blending modes or opacity. So if we just go into the opacity controls here. So now I have like this kind of subtle shift in our blacks and our highlights where the white in the background isn't exactly white, it's got a little bit of a yellow tint to it, and the shadows and the hair are a little bit orangey. So if you want to go into the shadow area and give it a little bit of a tint without adjusting the overall image in a very bold way, you can do something like this. You can also use any of the other tools. So a lot of these things can do very similar things, and it's kind of up to you to find the tools that you use the most often. So that is our assignment for this week. We're going to work with these camera raw images, and we're going to make adjustments. You'll have two of the images that you need to do. I would prefer if you did one with a light background and one with a dark background. One of them you have to use the camera raw filter to make your adjustments. The other one you'll use adjustment layers to make your adjustments. Feel free to use masks for any of this stuff, and you can potentially use the liquify filter on both or none. That is totally your creative choice on how you want to approach this thing. So make your adjustments, export these things as JPEGs, upload them to Canvas, and embed them for us to take a look at. So this should be a fairly easy project. It's very subjective. It's your personal aesthetics. We do want these things to look natural, so please don't push things into the heavy greens or the magentas. Keep skin tones looking natural. You can do some creative things like add color into your shadows or the black areas of your image, or potentially in the highlights as well. You can feel free to experiment there. But the hope is that you'll create some pleasing looking images, not anything that's like assaulting to our eyes, right? So pick two images and make them as pleasing as you can with the tools available to us. And give us a little bit of text and tell us which tools you use to get the effect that you're going for. All right, that's it this week. We'll see you next week with maybe our most complicated Photoshop tutorial of the semester.